The gunner sat motionless in his seat, metal cold against his back, the smell of oil and propellant residue thick in the confined space. Through the narrow slit of his periscope, he could see the distant tree line where intelligence reported enemy armor had been positioned. The light was failing. Visibility was poor. The ranging equipment had malfunctioned during the approach, and the crew had no reliable distance measurement to the target. The tank commander, standing in the turret above, had already given the order to engage. The gunner placed his hand on the traverse control, steadied his breathing, and prepared to fire at a target he could barely see. At a distance he could only estimate, with a round that cost more than most men earned in a month. The decision had already been made. What remained was execution. He aligned the reticle as best he could, compensating for what he believed to be the drop over what he guessed was 1,200 yards, and waited for the final command. The entire crew understood what this shot represented. If it missed, they would reveal their position without effect. If it connected, they might disable one of the most dangerous tanks the German army had fielded. There was no time for a second attempt. The Panther, if it was there, would respond immediately. The loader had already chambered the round. The driver sat ready to reverse into cover. The assistant driver monitored the radio, listening for any change in orders. Everything now depended on a calculation made under pressure, with incomplete information, by a man who had been with the crew for less than 2 weeks. To understand how he reached this moment, we must go back. The strategic situation in Europe during the autumn of 1944 was defined by momentum that had begun to slow. The breakout from Normandy had succeeded beyond initial expectations, and Allied armored units had pushed deep into France with remarkable speed. But that speed had created its own problems. Supply lines stretched thin. Fuel shortages became common. Replacement parts were delayed. The German army, which had been retreating in disorder, began to stabilize its defensive positions along more defensible terrain. The assumption among Allied planners had been that German armored strength was critically depleted, that the losses sustained during the summer fighting had permanently weakened their panzer divisions, and that the remaining tanks would be used sparingly, in small groups, to delay rather than defeat. This assumption was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. What intelligence had underestimated was the degree to which German industry had continued to produce new armor, and the extent to which remaining experienced crews had been consolidated into units that, while smaller in number, retained significant tactical effectiveness. The Panther tank, in particular, remained a formidable opponent. Its frontal armor was nearly impervious to the standard American 75mm gun at ranges beyond 500 yards, and its long-barreled 75mm gun could penetrate American Sherman armor at distances well over 1,000 yards. This created an engagement asymmetry that American crews were acutely aware of. The solution, in theory, was to use superior numbers, combined arms coordination, and air support to negate the technical advantage. In practice, weather often grounded aircraft, terrain limited maneuver, and the grinding nature of the advance meant that individual tank crews found themselves in situations where doctrine provided little comfort. The strategic miscalculation was not that the Allies would fail to advance, but that the advance would be easier than it was, and that the cost in men and machines would be lower. The consequences of this miscalculation were forming in ways that would not become fully apparent until winter. The gunner who would make the shot had arrived at the unit in late September. one of a steady stream of replacements sent to bring undermanned crews back to full strength. His training had been thorough by the standards of the time, but it had been conducted in the United States, on ranges where conditions were controlled, distances were measured, and targets did not return fire. He had qualified as a tank gunner, demonstrated competency with the gun's sight and fire controls, and understood the mechanical systems of the Sherman tank. What he did not have was combat experience. He did not know what it felt like to fire while the tank was moving over uneven ground, or to track a target while incoming rounds struck the hull, or to make rapid adjustments when the first shot missed and there was no time to recalculate. His assignment to the crew was not unusual. Casualties among tank crews were high enough that experienced gunners were lost regularly, and the replacement pipeline could not always provide men with prior combat exposure. The crew he joined had been together since Normandy. The tank commander was a sergeant with 5 months of frontline service, which made him a veteran by the standards of armored units at that stage of the war. The driver was competent and calm under fire. The loader was fast and reliable. The assistant driver handled radio communication efficiently. They had developed the kind of unspoken coordination that comes from shared danger and repeated action. The new gunner was an unknown variable. They did not distrust him, but they did not yet trust him either. Trust in a tank crew had to be earned through performance under pressure. The first few days with the unit were spent in reserve, conducting maintenance and integrating the new man into the crew's routines. The tank commander took time to explain how he preferred to direct fire, the typical ranges they engaged at, and the importance of conserving ammunition. Resupply was irregular, and every round mattered. The gunner listened, asked few questions, and worked to familiarize himself with the specific quirks of this particular tank. Each Sherman was slightly different. Sights could be slightly misaligned. Traverse controls could be stiff or loose. The gun itself might pull left or right, depending on where. Learning these idiosyncrasies was part of becoming effective. The doctrine that governed American armored tactics emphasized mobility, combined arms coordination, and the use of superior numbers to achieve local advantage. Individual tank versus tank engagements were to be avoided when possible. When unavoidable, American tanks were expected to use terrain, smoke, and maneuver to close the distance before engaging. This doctrine was logical given the technical limitations of the Sherman, but it assumed conditions that were not always present. It assumed that terrain allowed for concealed approach. It assumed that time was available to coordinate with supporting elements. It assumed that the enemy would be encountered in predictable formations. Reality frequently failed to meet these assumptions. The advance resumed in early October. The objective was a series of small towns that controlled road junctions necessary for further movement. Resistance was expected to be moderate. Intelligence indicated that German forces in the area consisted primarily of infantry, with limited armored support. The terrain was a mix of open farmland and patches of dense forest, with occasional ridgelines that provided observation over the surrounding area. The advance began at dawn, with infantry and armor moving in coordinated columns. Progress was steady for the first several hours. Villages were entered and cleared with minimal contact. By midday, the lead elements had reached a position several miles beyond the line of departure, and the operation seemed to be proceeding according to plan. It was at this point that the pattern began to shift. A forward reconnaissance element reported movement in a tree line to the north. The contact was brief and inconclusive. No shots were fired, The unit continued to advance, but with increased caution. 30 minutes later, a different unit reported possible armor signatures in a wooded area to the east. Again, the contact was not developed. The reports were logged and passed up the chain, but no immediate action was taken. The cumulative effect of these reports was to introduce uncertainty. The assumption that armored opposition would be light was now in question, but there was no clear evidence to confirm a significant threat. Commanders faced a choice. They could halt the advance and wait for clarification, which would sacrifice momentum and allow the enemy time to reinforce. Or they could continue forward, accepting the risk that the reports indicated something more substantial. The decision was made to continue, but to proceed more deliberately, with increased intervals between vehicles and more attention to potential ambush positions. This was a reasonable compromise, but it also meant that the advance slowed and that units became more dispersed. The consequence of dispersion was that when contact finally occurred, it occurred in isolated engagements rather than as part of a coordinated action. The first engagement happened in mid-afternoon. A platoon of Shermans, moving along a farm track, encountered fire from a concealed position at the edge of a wood line. The range was approximately 800 yards. The first round struck the lead tank in the turret, penetrating the armor and killing 2 crew members instantly. The remaining tanks returned fire and withdrew behind a low rise. The enemy tank, identified by survivors as a Panther, did not pursue. It remained in position, covered by terrain and vegetation, and continued to engage targets of opportunity. 2 more Shermans were hit before the platoon could fully withdraw. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. The tactical outcome was clear. The American platoon had been stopped, had taken significant losses, and had failed to neutralize the enemy tank. The broader implication was that German armor was present in greater strength than anticipated, that it was being used defensively to control key terrain, and that it was being employed by crews who understood how to maximize the technical advantages of their vehicles. The response was to bring forward additional units, coordinate with artillery to suppress known positions, and request air support to engage armor that could not be safely approached by ground forces. But weather had begun to deteriorate. Cloud cover was low and thickening. Air support was unlikely to be available before the following day. Artillery was effective at suppressing infantry, but less so against dug-in armor that could reposition after firing. The situation had shifted from an advance against moderate resistance to a more complex problem involving enemy armor in prepared positions with significant standoff capability. The success of the German defensive tactic introduced a new dynamic. If a single Panther, well positioned, could halt or significantly delay an American advance, then the logical response was to employ more tanks in similar roles, to use terrain and range to offset numerical disadvantage, and to force the Allies into costly frontal engagements. This was exactly what began to happen over the following days. The crew that included the new gunner had not been involved in the initial engagement, but they received the reports and understood what had occurred. The mood in the unit shifted. Conversations became more focused on tactics for dealing with Panthers. Crews discussed the importance of not silhouetting on ridgelines, of using covered approaches, of coordinating fires to suppress enemy positions before closing. The tank commander held a brief meeting with his crew to review procedures. He emphasized the need for patience, for not taking shots unless there was a reasonable probability of effect, and for prioritizing survival over aggressive action. The gunner listened and absorbed the information. But he also understood that theoretical discussion was different from actual performance under fire. He had not yet fired his gun in combat. He did not know how he would respond when the moment came. The following day, the unit was tasked with supporting an infantry advance along a different axis. The objective was to clear a series of fortified positions that had been slowing progress. The tanks were to provide direct fire support, engaging bunkers and strong points that infantry could not reduce with organic weapons. The mission was straightforward, and the risk of encountering enemy armor was considered low. The advance proceeded without incident for several hours. Targets were identified, engaged, and suppressed. Infantry moved forward and consolidated positions. By late afternoon, the immediate objectives had been secured, and the unit prepared to consolidate for the night. It was during this consolidation phase that the new contact occurred. An observation post reported movement in a tree line approximately 1,500 yards to the north. The movement was intermittent and difficult to assess. It could have been infantry. It could have been civilians. Or it could have been something else. The tank commander moved his vehicle to a position with better observation and scanned the tree line with binoculars. He saw nothing definitive, but the pattern of movement suggested something larger than dismounted personnel. He reported the contact and requested guidance. The response was to investigate, but to remain cautious. The tank moved forward slowly, using folds in the terrain to minimize exposure. As the range closed to approximately 1,200 yards, the gunner, scanning through his periscope, caught a brief glimpse of what he believed to be a tank hull, partially concealed by vegetation. He reported it immediately. The tank commander confirmed the sighting and assessed the situation. The target was at long range, partially obscured, and had not yet engaged. The terrain between their position and the tree line offered limited cover. If they advanced closer, they would be exposed. If they fired from their current position, the probability of a hit was low, and they would reveal themselves. The decision was complicated by the fact that the ranging equipment, which had been functioning earlier in the day, was now giving inconsistent readings. The rangefinder, a delicate optical instrument, had been jarred during movement over rough ground, and the crew had not had time to recalibrate it. Without accurate range data, the gunner would have to estimate holdover based on his judgment of the distance. This was not impossible, but it significantly increased the difficulty of the shot. The tank commander weighed his options. He could report the contact and wait for additional units to arrive, which would allow for a coordinated engagement, but would also give the enemy tank time to reposition or reinforce. He could attempt to close the distance, which would increase the probability of a hit, but would also expose his tank to fire during the approach. Or he could authorize a shot from the current position, accepting the low probability of success in exchange for the possibility of achieving surprise. He considered the crew's capabilities. The driver was steady. The loader was ready. The gunner was untested, but he had qualified well in training, and his performance during the previous days had been adequate. The tank commander made his decision. They would take the shot. He gave the order calmly, without urgency, and provided the gunner with his best estimate of the range. 1,200 yards, possibly more. The gunner acknowledged and began his adjustments. He cranked the elevation control, raising the gun tube to compensate for the ballistic drop over that distance. He steadied the traverse, centering the reticle on the portion of the target he could see. He understood that at this range, even a small error in elevation would result in a miss. Too high, and the round would pass over the target. Too low, and it would strike the ground in front. The margin for error was measured in mils, fractions of a degree. He made his final adjustment, confirmed that the gun was laid, and reported ready. The tank commander gave the command to fire. The gunner pressed the trigger. The gun recoiled. The breech slammed back, and the interior of the tank filled with smoke and noise. The round, a 76 millimeter armor-piercing projectile, left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second and began its arcing trajectory toward the target. The flight time at that range was slightly more than 1 second. During that second, the crew waited. There was no immediate way to know if the shot had connected. The gunner kept his eye to the sight, trying to observe the impact. The loader had already opened the breech and was prepared to load another round if needed. The tank commander, standing in the turret, watched through his binoculars. Then, at the tree line, there was a flash, followed by a column of dark smoke. The round had struck the target. The impact was visible, even at that distance. The enemy tank did not move. There was no return fire. After several seconds, flames became visible, spreading quickly across the hull. The Panther had been hit and disabled, possibly destroyed, by a single shot fired under conditions that should have made success unlikely. The immediate reaction within the crew was subdued. There was no celebration, no excitement. The tank commander confirmed the hit, reported it to higher command, and ordered the crew to remain alert for additional threats. The loader replaced the expended round. The gunner continued to scan for targets. The driver kept the engine running, ready to move if required. The professionalism of the response was partly due to training, and partly due to the understanding that one successful engagement did not guarantee safety. There could be other enemy tanks in the area. They could still come under fire. The situation remained dangerous. But there was also a quiet acknowledgement among the crew that something significant had occurred. A gunner with no combat experience had made a shot that experienced crews would have considered difficult, and he had done so on his first attempt under combat conditions. The round had flown true. The calculations had been correct, and the result had been decisive. The crew did not discuss it immediately, but they would discuss it later, and the event would become part of the unit's collective memory. For the gunner himself, the experience was less dramatic than external observers might imagine. He had followed his training, made the adjustments he believed were necessary, and executed the shot as he had been taught. The success was gratifying, but it was also sobering. He understood that he had been fortunate. A slight miscalculation, a gust of wind, a moment of hesitation, and the outcome would have been different. The responsibility of his role became more concrete. Lives depended on his accuracy, not just the lives of his own crew, but the lives of infantry who relied on armor support, and the success of missions that depended on suppressing enemy firepower. The weight of that responsibility was something that training could describe, but not fully convey. Now he understood it directly. The engagement was reported up the chain of command and analyzed by unit intelligence officers. The confirmed destruction of a Panther at long range by a single Sherman was noteworthy. It contradicted the prevailing assumption that Shermans could not effectively engage Panthers beyond medium range. The fact that the shot had been made without reliable ranging data made it even more remarkable. Questions were asked about how the gunner had calculated the holdover, what visual references he had used, and whether the technique could be replicated. The gunner provided a straightforward account. He had estimated the range based on the apparent size of the target and the surrounding terrain features. He had applied the elevation correction he believed was appropriate for that distance. He had centered the reticle on the most visible portion of the hull. He had fired when he felt confident in the lay. There was no secret technique, no special insight. It was simply a matter of applying fundamentals under pressure. The officers who debriefed him were not entirely satisfied with this answer. They wanted something more concrete, something that could be taught and systematized. But the reality of long-range gunnery is that it involves a degree of judgment that cannot be fully reduced to procedure. Experienced gunners develop an intuition for holdover and lead based on repeated practice and exposure to different conditions. The new gunner had demonstrated that intuition despite his lack of experience, which suggested either exceptional aptitude or exceptional luck, probably some combination of both. The broader lesson, however, was clear. The technical limitations of the Sherman did not make it incapable of engaging heavier German armor at range. What was required was skilled gunnery, patience, and the willingness to take carefully calculated risks. This lesson began to be incorporated into unit training and tactical guidance. The days following the engagement brought further opportunities to apply these lessons. German defensive tactics continued to emphasize the use of armor in overwatch positions, forcing American units to either accept casualties during frontal approaches or to expend time and resources on flanking maneuvers. Tank commanders became more willing to authorize long-range shots when conditions allowed. Crews practiced range estimation techniques, using terrain features and known dimensions of enemy vehicles to improve accuracy. Gunners experimented with different holdover methods, comparing results and sharing techniques. The cumulative effect was a gradual improvement in the effectiveness of American tank gunnery at extended ranges. This did not eliminate the technical disadvantages of the Sherman, but it reduced the degree to which those disadvantages dictated tactical outcomes. The German response was to become more cautious in their employment of armor, to avoid positions where they could be engaged from unexpected angles or distances, and to increase their reliance on infantry anti-tank weapons that could be more easily concealed. This created a new set of challenges, but it also indicated that the initial asymmetry in tank versus tank engagements was beginning to narrow. The process was incremental and uneven, but the direction was clear. American crews were learning to fight more effectively against technically superior opponents, and that learning was driven as much by individual initiative and adaptation as by formal doctrine. The crew continued to operate together through the remainder of October and into November. They participated in additional engagements, some successful, some costly. The gunner fired many more rounds in combat, and his proficiency continued to improve. He learned to compensate for the movement of his own tank, to track moving targets, and to make rapid adjustments when the first shot missed. He also learned the limits of his equipment and his own abilities. There were shots he should have made and did not. There were moments when his judgment was wrong, and rounds were wasted. Combat is an imperfect process, and even skilled crews make mistakes. What mattered was consistency over time, the ability to perform adequately under a wide range of conditions, and the capacity to learn from errors without becoming paralyzed by them. The tank commander, observing the gunner's development, gradually increased his confidence in the crew's capabilities. He became more willing to take on difficult missions, to accept tasks that required precision fires, and to position the tank in ways that maximized its effectiveness. This confidence was mutual. The gunner trusted the commander's judgment about when to engage and when to withdraw. The loader trusted the gunner to make his shots count, so that ammunition was not wasted. The driver trusted that the crew would provide warning of threats he could not see from his position. This trust was the foundation of the crew's effectiveness, and it had been built through shared experience and demonstrated competence. The broader impact of the engagement, and others like it, became apparent in the weeks and months that followed. After-action reports began to emphasize the importance of gunnery training and the potential for effective long-range engagements. Training programs in rear areas incorporated more practice at extended distances. Crews were encouraged to take the time to properly zero their sights and to verify the accuracy of their ranging equipment. Tank commanders were given greater latitude to authorize shots when they assessed that the probability of success justified the expenditure of ammunition. These changes were not revolutionary, but they were meaningful. They represented a shift in thinking about how American tanks should be employed, and they reflected the accumulated lessons of hundreds of small engagements where individual crews had found ways to overcome technical disadvantages through skill and determination. The process was decentralized and organic, driven more by battlefield experience than by top-down directives, but it was nonetheless real. The institutional knowledge of armored units was evolving, and that evolution was making them more effective. The human cost of these engagements was significant and should not be minimized. The crew that included the gunner lost members to enemy fire during subsequent operations. Tanks were destroyed, men were killed or wounded, and the grinding nature of the advance continued. The successful shot at 1,200 yards did not make the crew invulnerable. It did not prevent future casualties. It did not shorten the war. What it did was provide one example of effective performance under difficult conditions, and that example contributed to a broader process of learning and adaptation. The men who fought in these units understood that their survival depended on many factors, some within their control and some not. Skill mattered, training mattered, equipment mattered, but so did luck, and no amount of skill could eliminate the role of chance in combat. The gunner who made the shot understood this as well as anyone. He had performed well when it mattered, but he also knew that the outcome could easily have been different. He carried that knowledge with him, and it informed his approach to every subsequent engagement. The legacy of the engagement was preserved in the informal histories of the unit. Stories were told about the new gunner who made an impossible shot, and those stories were embellished over time in the way that such stories always are. The details became less precise. The range grew longer in some tellings. The conditions became more difficult, but the core truth remained. A young man with limited experience had performed exceptionally well under pressure, and his performance had contributed to the success of his unit and the safety of his crew. That was worth remembering. It was worth honoring, and it was worth learning from. The crews who came after him, who heard the story and understood its implications, were better prepared because of it. They knew that technical limitations could be overcome. They knew that effective gunnery mattered. They knew that training and discipline could make the difference between success and failure. These were not new lessons, but they were lessons that needed to be relearned and reinforced constantly, because the conditions of combat eroded knowledge as surely as they eroded equipment. The end of the war in Europe came in the spring of the following year. The crew that had made the engagement survived, though not all of its original members were still with the unit. The gunner returned home and resumed civilian life. He did not speak often about his experiences. When asked, he provided brief and factual accounts, without embellishment or drama. He had done his job. He had served with good men. He had been fortunate to survive. That was how he framed it, and that was how most veterans of his generation framed their service. The war had been necessary. It had been difficult. It was over. What mattered now was moving forward. But he also understood that the experience had changed him in ways that were difficult to articulate. He had learned what he was capable of under pressure. He had learned the value of competence and preparation. He had learned that decisions made in moments of crisis could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. These lessons stayed with him and influenced how he approached challenges in civilian life. They were not lessons he could easily share with people who had not had similar experiences, but they were real nonetheless. The historical record of the engagement is fragmentary. After-action reports mention the destruction of an enemy tank at long range, but they do not provide extensive detail. The names of the crew members are recorded in unit rosters, but the specific circumstances of individual engagements are rarely documented with the kind of precision that later historians would prefer. What remains is a combination of official records, personal accounts, and the collective memory of the units involved. These sources are not always consistent. Details are disputed. Timelines are uncertain. But the essential facts are not in question. An engagement occurred. A difficult shot was made. The outcome was significant, and the experience contributed to the broader process by which American armored forces learned to fight more effectively against capable opponents. This process of learning, adaptation, and incremental improvement is as much a part of the history of the war as the larger strategic decisions and major operations that receive more attention. It is the history of how ordinary men, placed in extraordinary circumstances, found ways to overcome challenges through skill, determination, and mutual support. The technical analysis of the shot, conducted after the war by military historians and gunnery experts, confirmed that the engagement was at the outer edge of effective range for the 76 mm gun mounted on the Sherman. At 1,200 yards, the round would have had significant drop, and the gunner would have needed to aim several feet above the target to compensate. The fact that the round struck center mass suggested either precise calculation or exceptional luck. Experts who examined the ballistics concluded that the gunner's estimation of range and holdover must have been very close to correct, which indicated a high level of skill or intuition. The question of whether such a shot could be reliably replicated was debated. Some argued that the success was primarily due to chance, and that attempting similar shots would waste ammunition and reveal positions without achieving results. Others argued that trained gunners, given adequate time and stable firing positions, could achieve similar results with reasonable consistency. The debate was never fully resolved, but the practical outcome was that long-range gunnery became a more accepted part of armored tactics, and crews were given the training and authorization to attempt such shots when conditions warranted. The psychological impact of the engagement on both sides is worth considering. For American crews, the successful destruction of a Panther at long range provided a morale boost and a sense that they were not entirely outmatched by heavier German armor. This was important because the technical superiority of tanks like the Panther and Tiger had created a psychological burden for Sherman crews, who understood that they were often at a disadvantage in direct engagements. Knowing that skilled gunnery could overcome that disadvantage, at least in some circumstances, made the prospect of combat less daunting. For German crews, the engagement was one of many indicators that American forces were becoming more proficient and that the initial advantages of superior armor were eroding. German tank commanders became more cautious about remaining in static positions for extended periods, and they increased their emphasis on mobility and rapid repositioning after engagement. This shift in tactics was a rational response to changing conditions, but it also indicated that the initiative was gradually shifting away from the defender and toward the attacker. The cumulative effect of many small engagements like this one was to change the character of armored warfare on the Western Front during the final months of the war. The doctrinal implications of the engagement extended beyond the immediate tactical level. American armored doctrine at the beginning of the war had emphasized mobility and exploitation rather than direct confrontation with enemy armor. This made sense given the strategic role that tanks were expected to play, and it reflected the reality that American tanks were not designed primarily to fight other tanks. But the experience of combat in Europe demonstrated that tank versus tank engagements were unavoidable, and that American forces needed to develop capabilities and tactics for winning those engagements. The process of doctrinal evolution was slow and often reactive, driven by battlefield experience rather than pre-war planning. The successful engagement at 1,200 yards was one data point among many that informed this evolution. It demonstrated that the Sherman, despite its limitations, could be effective against heavier German armor when employed skillfully. It reinforced the importance of gunnery training and proper equipment maintenance, and it provided a concrete example that could be used in training to illustrate the principles of long-range engagement. These lessons were incorporated into post-war doctrine and influenced the design and employment of subsequent generations of armored vehicles. The crew's experience also illustrated the importance of crew cohesion and the process by which new members were integrated into experienced teams. The gunner had been a replacement, arriving at a unit where the other crew members had already established working relationships and shared combat experience. His acceptance into the crew was not automatic. It required him to demonstrate competence and reliability under pressure. The successful shot was a critical moment in that process. It established his credibility and allowed the other crew members to trust him in a way that would not have been possible otherwise. This pattern of integration through demonstrated performance was common in combat units, and it highlighted the difference between formal training and practical competence. Training could provide the skills and knowledge necessary to perform a task, but only actual performance under combat conditions could prove that those skills could be applied when it mattered. The informal mechanisms by which units assessed and integrated new members were as important as formal training programs, and they played a crucial role in maintaining unit effectiveness despite high casualty rates and constant turnover. The engagement also raised questions about the role of individual initiative and judgment in combat operations. The tank commander's decision to authorize the shot was not mandated by doctrine or directed by higher command. It was a tactical decision made in the moment, based on his assessment of the situation and his confidence in his crew's capabilities. This kind of decentralized decision-making was essential to effective combat operations, but it also carried risks. A poor decision could result in wasted ammunition, revealed positions, or unnecessary casualties. A good decision could achieve decisive results. The difference often came down to the commander's judgment and his understanding of his own capabilities and limitations. The institutional challenge was to train commanders to make good decisions consistently, while also giving them the latitude to exercise initiative when circumstances required it. This balance between centralized control and decentralized execution was a constant tension in military operations, and it was never perfectly resolved. But the engagement illustrated the value of empowering junior leaders to make tactical decisions based on their direct observation of the situation. The story of the engagement, as it has been preserved and transmitted over the years, has taken on a certain mythic quality. It has become an example of individual heroism and technical proficiency, a story that is told to illustrate the courage and skill of the men who fought in the war. This mythologizing process is natural and perhaps inevitable. People want stories that affirm their values and provide clear examples of virtue. But it is important to remember that the engagement was not isolated or unique. Many similar engagements occurred throughout the war, involving different crews, different circumstances, and different outcomes. Some were successful, others were not. The gunner who made the shot would have been the first to acknowledge that he was not unique, that many other men performed similar feats, and that his success was due as much to the support of his crew and the quality of his training as to any individual ability. The tendency to focus on individual acts of heroism can obscure the broader reality of combat, which is that success depends on the collective efforts of many people, most of whom will never be individually recognized. The gunner's shot mattered, but so did the work of the loader who prepared the round, the tank commander who made the decision to engage, the driver who positioned the tank effectively, and the countless support personnel who maintained the equipment and supplied the ammunition. All of these contributions were necessary, and all of them deserve recognition. The preservation of the story also raises questions about historical memory and the ways in which the past is remembered and interpreted. The engagement has been documented in unit histories, mentioned in veteran interviews, and referenced in popular accounts of the war. But the details vary across these sources, and it is not always clear which version is most accurate. This is a common problem in military history. The fog of war that obscures events as they happen does not necessarily clear with the passage of time. Memory is fallible. Records are incomplete. Accounts are shaped by the perspectives and biases of those who provide them. The task of the historian is to navigate these uncertainties, to weigh different sources against each other, and to construct a narrative that is as accurate as possible while acknowledging the limitations of the evidence. The engagement at 1,200 yards is well documented by the standards of small unit actions during the war. But even so, there are details that remain uncertain, and questions that cannot be definitively answered. This does not diminish the significance of the event, but it does remind us that history is always an interpretation, not a simple recording of facts. The impact of the engagement on the individuals involved was profound and lasting. The gunner carried the memory of that moment for the rest of his life. It was a defining experience, one that shaped his understanding of himself and his capabilities. He did not seek recognition or fame for what he had done, but he also did not forget it. The experience gave him a sense of confidence that he carried into civilian life, a knowledge that he could perform under pressure and that his training and preparation mattered. The other crew members also carried memories of the engagement, though their perspectives were different. The tank commander remembered it as a validation of his decision to trust a new gunner. The loader remembered it as an example of the importance of doing his job quickly and correctly. The driver remembered it as a moment when the crew functioned as a cohesive unit. These different perspectives, all valid, illustrate the complexity of combat experience and the ways in which a single event can be understood and remembered in multiple ways. The passage of time has given the engagement a historical significance that was not apparent when it occurred. At the time, it was one engagement among thousands, a successful action that contributed to the gradual advance of Allied forces across Europe. In retrospect, it can be seen as part of a larger pattern, a moment that illustrates broader themes about adaptation, learning, and the human dimension of combat. The men who fought in the war did not have the luxury of historical perspective. They were focused on immediate challenges, on surviving the next engagement, on completing the next mission. But their actions, taken together, created the historical record that we now study and interpret. The engagement at 1,200 yards is significant, not because it was unique, but because it was representative. It represents the thousands of small actions performed by ordinary men under extraordinary circumstances that collectively determined the outcome of the war. It represents the importance of training and preparation. It represents the value of courage and competence. And it represents the reality that war is ultimately a human endeavor, shaped by individual decisions and actions as much as by grand strategy and technological capability. The memory of the engagement has been preserved not only in official records and historical accounts, but also in the informal traditions of the units that participated. Veterans who served in those units passed the story down to later generations of soldiers, using it as a teaching tool and as a source of unit pride. This kind of informal transmission is an important part of military culture. It creates continuity across generations, linking current service members to the experiences and traditions of those who came before. It provides examples of effective performance that can inspire and instruct, and it reinforces the values and standards that define the unit's identity. The story of the gunner's shot became part of that tradition, a story that was told to new crew members to illustrate what was possible, to emphasize the importance of training and discipline, and to honor the memory of those who had served. This process of cultural transmission is as important as formal training in maintaining unit effectiveness and cohesion. The engagement also serves as a reminder of the importance of seemingly small decisions and actions in determining larger outcomes. The decision to authorize the shot, the gunner's careful calculation of holdover, the loader's quick preparation of the round, the driver's steady positioning of the tank. All of these individual actions were necessary for the success of the engagement. If any one of them had been performed poorly, or not at all, the outcome would have been different. This is true of combat generally. Success depends on the accumulation of many small actions, each performed competently, in coordination with others. Failure can result from a single mistake or oversight. The pressure to perform consistently under conditions of stress and danger is immense. The fact that military units can achieve this level of performance repeatedly and reliably is a testament to the effectiveness of training, the strength of unit cohesion, and the resilience of the human spirit. The engagement at 1,200 yards is an example of what is possible when all of these factors align. The story of the engagement has also been used in discussions about the design and procurement of military equipment. The fact that a Sherman, despite its technical limitations, could successfully engage a Panther at long range has been cited both by those who argue that the Sherman was an adequate tank for its intended role, and by those who argue that better equipment would have reduced casualties and improved effectiveness. Both perspectives have merit. The Sherman was adequate in the sense that, when employed skillfully, it could accomplish its missions and defeat enemy armor. But it was also true that Sherman crews faced significant disadvantages in direct engagements with heavier German tanks, and that many casualties resulted from these technical disparities. The debate about the Sherman's adequacy is part of a larger debate about the balance between quantity and quality in military procurement, about the trade-offs between producing large numbers of adequate weapons versus smaller numbers of superior weapons. This debate has continued in various forms throughout the post-war period, and it remains relevant today. The engagement at 1,200 yards does not resolve this debate, but it provides a concrete example that informs it. The final reckoning of the engagement must acknowledge both what was achieved and what was lost. A dangerous enemy tank was destroyed. A crew demonstrated exceptional skill under difficult conditions. Tactical lessons were learned that improved the effectiveness of subsequent operations. These were real and significant achievements, but they came at a cost. The war continued. More engagements followed. More men were killed or wounded. The success of one shot did not change the fundamental calculus of the conflict or eliminate the dangers that tank crews faced daily. The recognition of this duality, of success and cost, of achievement and sacrifice, is essential to an honest understanding of combat. War is not a series of heroic moments. It is a grinding, dangerous, often chaotic process in which success is measured in small increments and at significant cost. The men who fought understood this. They did their jobs, supported each other, and tried to survive. When they succeeded, it was cause for quiet satisfaction, not celebration. When they failed, it was cause for grief and determination to do better. This pragmatic, unsentimental approach to combat is perhaps the most important lesson that can be drawn from the engagement and from the experiences of the men who participated in it. The legacy of the engagement, and of the countless other small actions like it, is preserved in the broader history of the war and in the collective memory of those who served. It is a legacy of competence, courage, and mutual support under extraordinarily difficult conditions. It is a legacy that honors the men who fought and died, not by romanticizing their experiences or glorifying war, but by recognizing the reality of what they faced and the skill and determination they brought to their tasks. It is a legacy that continues to inform military training and doctrine, that shapes our understanding of combat, and that reminds us of the human cost of war. The gunner who made the shot at 1,200 yards was one man among millions who served. His action was significant, but it was also representative of the larger efforts of his generation. To remember him is to remember them all, and to honor the sacrifice and service that they rendered.